So thank you so much for coming tonight to an introduction to historical redlining in Oberlin, Ohio. My name is Liz Schultz, and I'm the Executive Director of the Oberlin Heritage Center. I see many familiar faces in the room, but also some new faces. So if you're not familiar with us, we are a local historical society. We're located behind Lorenzo's or behind the post office in the middle of that block there. We do programs, year-round tours, outreach programs to classrooms and to adult groups as well, and research services, many other things. So we're not part of the city or college, so if you like tonight's program, please consider becoming a member. That really helps our organization. So this program is called an Introduction to Historical Redlining because you could talk about redlining for hours or weeks. This is going to be hitting some highlights over the course of Oberlin's history. I will admit it's just over an hour long, but I'm going to be moving through information as quickly as I can, but in a way that I actually convey it to you. So pardon me once in a while as I'm looking at my notes. So I'm going to start off with a few disclaimers and acknowledgments. So one, whenever we're talking about housing and property, we should acknowledge that this, of course, was indigenous land for thousands of years before the colony of Oberlin was settled. Little personal information, I currently rent an apartment on the west side of Oberlin, which was historically more of a white neighborhood. Many of the topics I'm going to be touching on tonight are not my areas of expertise, such as land development, insurance, banking, and law. I just have a position that puts me in touch with stories from around the community, so I get to share them tonight. What I bring are examples from Oberlin's history that demonstrate this national and local, pervasive and deliberate form of discrimination. Now, certainly many people do not need this introduction as they or their families have lived this history. Sometimes I will be quoting language that was used historically but is not appropriate today. And some of the stories you hear today might also make you sad or angry. But I hope if that prompts you to look more closely at housing conditions today and take action, then that is a good thing. So a few additional resources if you are interested in learning more after this program, if you haven't already read these. So Elusive Utopia is a great book about some difficult topics about the increase in racial discrimination and segregation in Oberlin, and it's written by Carol Lasser and Gary Kornbluth. I don't know if you like to be called out or not, Carol, but one of the authors is here as well.
Always fun to listen to.
So excellent book that goes into a lot of these stories on a deeper level. And then The Color of Law, there are also books about redlining. This is the one that I happen to use for national context to help me understand this history a little bit better. And then there's a website called Mapping Inequality. Sometimes it doesn't get to, towns as small as Oberlin, but I recommend you check it out if you have a chance. And then for an Ohio-based documentary about this, you can see redlining, mapping inequality in Dayton and Springfield. And I will be pulling from various resources today, but I will also end the program with, if you have stories to share, I hope you might stay afterward to talk with me or leave a note on the table and I will follow up with you. So what is redlining? So these are definitions from the dictionary. To withhold home loan funds or insurance from neighborhoods considered poor economic risks, or to discriminate against in housing or insurance. So the first term related to insurance is where the term originates. The second shows how this term is now broadly used to describe housing segregation in many different forms, such as finances, law, or other means. So I'm going to briefly just talk about that term redlining. And then we'll get into Oberlin specific history. To date, I will say I have not found any insurance maps of Oberlin like this. Most of them seem to be from cities, but if anyone does come across one, please do let me know. So I found these on the Ohio State University website. So maps like these were prepared by the Division of Research and Statistics with cooperation from the Appraisal Department of the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And you might hear that group fairly often if you're looking into redlining, the Homeowners Loan Corporation. So they were in the 1930s. The Homeowners Loan Corporation was started during the Great Depression to refinance mortgages in default and to prevent foreclosures. And they created, with others, these what they called residential security maps. Just keep in mind that during the Depression, many of those programs seen as great as really kind of jump-starting the country again, many of those incentives were intended for white Americans and restricted to white Americans. The book, The Color of Law, also makes it clear that many of the leaders of those kind of Depression-era organizations were both working for the government and also in private finance and housing, which meant that they could really set the terms of housing at that time. And when they wrote national documents like the Underwriter Handbook, they could include blatantly discriminatory guidance because they controlled all the pieces on the board. I'm going to read the definition of what these residential security maps were for. They were to, and I'm quoting here, graphically reflect the trend of desirability in neighborhoods from a residential viewpoint. In establishing the grade of an area, such factors as these are considered: intensity of the sale and rental demand, percentage of home ownership, age and type of buildings, economic stability of areas, social status of the population, sufficiency of public utilities, accessibility of schools, churches, and business centers, transportation methods, topography of the area, and the restrictions set up to protect the neighborhood. The price level of the home is not the guiding factor. So that's a long definition, and there's a lot to unpack there. But one thing you might notice is that race is not mentioned in that language directly. But I think when you get to terms like social status and protect the neighborhood, it is implied in there. But also the survey forms that were used to create these maps did explicitly have spots to note foreign-born people, Negroes, and to note whether infiltration was desirable. And in short, the better grade you got, the better the terms of your loan. So red was grade D, in which neighborhoods, in which things are now taking place in C neighborhoods have already happened. This is quoting again. They are characterized by detrimental influences in a pronounced degree, undesirable population, or an infiltration of it. And again, those areas would get poorer loans or other restrictions set on them. So it was a cyclical thing that if you lived in this neighborhood, you also got worse services and worse opportunities, and it just kept cycling through. And as I said earlier, this is, I could not find one for Oberlin, but this is the nearest one I could find. So let's jump to Oberlin. There are many great sources about Oberlin's nationally significant history as it relates to race relations and equality, really remarkable practices in the early 1800s and mid-1800s. I'm not going to get into that so much. Just know that throughout much of Oberlin's history, about 5 to 25% of the population is Black or African American, and that kind of moves around over time. But we're going to jump into this program more around the 1900s with the understanding that, with some notable exceptions, most Black community members lived on the east side of town and the southeast side in particular. And what we're going to see is that segregation solidifies over time and gets worse over time. So we're going to jump right into codified housing segregation in Oberlin. So this is when we can collectively drop the idea that housing segregation just happened, or that this is something that Black residents preferred. So race-based restrictive covenants or deed restrictions can be set by either real estate developers or owners, and they follow with the property even after it is sold. So before I get into the history of Hollywood Street, just wanted to credit Rob Thompson for his thorough research on the history of this street, as well as being upfront about this history of the street as well. So hopefully you all got a map. I'll try to remember to be referencing it. I did a pilot program, and they told me you need to refer to the map more often. So I won't do in the program too much, but I'll try to give you some pointers. So Hollywood Street, we're talking about the northwest side of town. So the purple arrow showing where it is today. So the purple line here is where that Hollywood Street is going to be built. The purple arrow shows the Cherry property. This is Byron and Emma Cherry, who sold what would be called the Hollywood Edition. So if you're curious, actually I'll get to it on the next slide. So the Cherry Schultz, I'm not sure if they hired or how he came involved, but Herbert W. Smith was the real estate agent and auctioneer from Mount Vernon, Ohio, and he entered into the land contract with the Cherries in 1909. And we don't know why he named it Hollywood Street. So this is a map where they started to plot out the different land chunks of the Hollywood Edition from 1909. So this is an ad that went out in May of 1909. I know it's small text. I'm going to be reading you highlights from it. So these are the exciting parts. All lots are high, dry, and level as a floor, and most of them are within 10-minute walk of the college. Actually sounds great for Oberlin. Every lot put up will be sold regardless of the bid, making this the grandest opportunity ever offered the home seeker and investor of Oberlin. Terms very liberal: free deed in case of death, free presents, free carriages, meaning carriage rides, free band concert. Now is the time to buy real estate if you wish to make money, and Hollywood is the place. Come out and help boom Oberlin by giving us the benefit of your presence, whether you are interested in building lots or not. Sounds like a great party. But then you read the fine language. This is in the free presents section. To those who attend this sale, we will give the beautiful line of silverware valued at $600 now on exhibition in the window of E.J. Goodrich's bookstore, corner of Main and College Streets. You do not have to buy a lot to get a present, but you must be at the sale. No presents given to children or colored people. So nothing in this ad says that people of color can't buy, but they could clearly read between the lines here. And that's a good indication to anyone considering this property. But it was not only that, it was also legal. So this was in, I only looked at 3 or 4 of them, but these are in the original land deeds from that property. So as a further additional and valuable consideration for the sale of this property, it is stipulated, covenanted, and agreed on the part of the party of the second part for herself and her heirs and assigns that the property hereby conveyed shall not be sold, rented to, or occupied by anyone belonging to the Negro race, and that the foregoing covenants, stipulations, and agreements shall run with the land. So with that in mind, let's jump back to that earlier statement from the ad. Now is the time to buy real estate if you wish to make money, and Hollywood is the place. So home buying and home equity affects generational wealth. So this developer and the landowners have now restricted that opportunity, and it's legal. And it was very common in individual deeds, neighborhoods, or developments in the country. And when earlier we saw that map, they were talking about protecting the neighborhood, that if you had restrictions that protected the neighborhood, they're talking about deed restrictions like that. That if you had something like this, that would make your neighborhood a higher grade on those maps. But let's look forward a bit. Is this just one developer? Is this just one neighborhood in Oberlin with these attitudes? This is from 1913, and this is highlighted in the book Elusive Utopia. It's a letter conversation between Louis Bergner, who is a real estate broker, and Oberlin College president Henry Churchill King. And basically Bergner is asking for advice. It says, recently I have been importuned by one set of lines to sell to a colored man a property on Forest Street, if you're looking on your maps, the west side of town, and by property owners to the contrary. Is it right, in your judgment, for decent, clean, reputable colored people to acquire real estate in good white neighborhoods? And King, president of the college, played both sides. He said it was right for those kinds of colored people to acquire real estate in good white neighborhoods, but, quote, one cannot leave out of account the fact fact that, in view of prejudices in most communities, the financial value of other property in the vicinity of such a purchase is affected, and one may question whether he has a right to produce such an effect upon the property of others, though he feels the injustice of the general position taken. And that property value argument is pervasive and debatable. But a trend that you'll see in talking about redlining is often when people are talking about the right of affecting other people's property values, they clearly mean the rights of the white residents. And King also uses the excuse of what is going on in other communities to affect his decision of what is going on in Oberlin here, when really, as president of the college, he could have taken a stand on this. Now, Bergner replies, outright says, I heartily feel that an agent has no right to introduce colored residents in white neighborhoods. And I always wonder, like, well, why did you ask? If that's what you felt. But he also calls out the college on its hypocrisy for its lauded history when Bergner knew that there were, at that time, separating white dormitories and black dormitories. So he's calling King to account for that. And King's response is diplomatic and non-committal about the issue any further. So just keep in mind, this is 1913, we're going to be moving forward in time. But also keep in mind the influence of just these two men in Oberlin. This is like the real estate agent of town, and that's the president of college, and they're having this conversation. You know, what power do they hold? I'm gonna step out from Oberlin just for a little bit to put in some milestones related to national redlining. So 1917 Buchanan versus Worley was a Supreme Court decision that kind of started to eat away at redlining. It struck down city or government ordinances or zoning related to race. The ordinance said that the ordinance he struck down said that members of a race could not purchase where the other race was the majority. And this was in Louisville, Kentucky. The Supreme Court determined that that decision interfered with due process of law and property owner rights, basically saying property owners can sell to whoever they want to sell to. And there were a few other things they called Kentucky on, basically saying it wasn't a well-written law anyway. So, you know, this starts the end of government restrictions on housing. And it sounds like good news, but if you look at the decision, the court didn't really decide that way for racial reasons. It was still about property rights. So they weren't quite hitting at the core of why it was wrong. So the government could no longer set those restrictions, so people found ways around them. I just put that away when I'm actually still reading them. So covenants, like Hollywood Street, were still fine. That was a private decision. You could also use economic zoning. Now, I just said you couldn't use racial zoning, but you could use economic zoning to come to a lot of the same impact. This was an interesting workaround from Richmond, Virginia. Ordinance is saying that people couldn't move to a block where they were prohibited from marrying the majority of people on that block. And that's how they got around it. And many other communities just ignored the Supreme Court decision anyway. Now, I don't think Oberlin ever had government-level restrictions, as far as I know yet. So the Buchanan versus Worley didn't really come home to Oberlin. I mean, in terms of tone, it could have, but it didn't change anything. Moving forward just 2 years, and thanks to Carol for bringing this to my attention. This was a letter written from Bertha H. Leonard to her husband, Fred E. Leonard. She says, had quite a little excitement in Oberlin, especially East College Street residents, when Mr. Edwards sold Jenny property to a colored man from Alabama. It seemed the Sages were leasing the house until September, had a clause in their lease giving them 24 hours option on the house. So Mr. Bergner, that real estate broker, Roland, Allen, and Porter, a banker in town, had him, meaning Sage, go to Elyria and file some sort of injunction and then buy property, which he immediately turned over to these men. We thereby escaped having colored neighbors. So you can see both individual attitudes, but also the power play happening in Oberlin. So that was 1919. I just found this oral history quote from the she's remembering the 1920s. But you can see Elizabeth asking, do you remember any of your neighbors being black? And Marie Leahy says, no, not where I lived. In Oberlin, they weren't black. Were all the blacks in one area? They must have been. I didn't know any of them. And I think that was a common perception of white Oberlinians, that segregation was not in their consciousness until something happened to bring it into their consciousness, like what happened on East College Street. But certainly the white residents might have been oblivious or enforcing it, actively enforcing it. But black residents knew what was going on. This is an article from The Crisis, which is the national magazine of the NAACP. So Oberlin is making news there, and not in a good way. At an Oberlin meeting of students and townsmen, over which the thoughtful young president of the Radical Club presided, various cases of discrimination against colored residents, comprising about a fifth of the population, were cited. For instance, it was stated that a colored person was not permitted to enter certain barbershops until after the regular closing hours, when white patrons had ceased to come. It was shown that Oberlin was headed towards segregation. For instance, a brilliant colored minister experienced considerable difficulty in renting a house for his family because the streets that virtually had become inhabited by Negroes were filled, and the real estate agent meticulously steered the prospective tenant away from empty houses in other sections. And what the Color of Law, that book, argued is that when you have situations like this, limited places where African Americans could find housing, landlords could charge higher rents because they knew there was limited opportunity. They were somewhat trapped there. So again, it's that double cycle of not having opportunity and being punished for it as well. And in addition, when African Americans were able to purchase in white neighborhoods, property values may actually go up because they were paying for that opportunity and knew they almost had a premium, had to pay a premium on that. So this is 1920s, we're going to jump to the 1930s. So this is Alva Beatrice Maxey, and later Boyd, was a young black woman who wrote her thesis for Oberlin College, which was denied and temporarily pulled because of its stark observations of what was happening in Oberlin in the 1930s. So very interesting thesis. I'm just going to read this part related to housing. And this is quoting her. To believe that there are colored houses in Oberlin may be difficult for those who have read the history of Oberlin or those who believe that Oberlin is a place where a man's a man. There are colored houses in Oberlin. The term colored houses is commonly heard among the members of the race. It means a house that can be rented by Negroes. It is a fact that Negroes and whites do not make a habit of using the same houses. There are certain houses in the several areas where Negroes have lived and continue to live. There may be only a single house in a whole block that is open to Negroes. She includes a lot more information, including an anecdote of a black family struggling to find housing. Sometimes when they went around, they were given just, amorphous excuses, but sometimes they were told outright that it was not desirable to rent to Negroes. They only secured a house on North Park Street through intervention from family friends. So you had to have those connections to get anywhere close to breaking that barrier. Maxey also noted that the entire length of Park Street on your map, you can see it runs north-south quite a bit of distance, heavily populated by black families. The only paved block, right in the middle, like between College and the Ring, was the one with white families on it. So you had to go through that one block. So this is 33. Around that same time, Frederick Zorba in 1934 started a survey. He was the secretary of a committee tasked by the Oberlin Village Council with doing a study. Now, it went over a lot of different things: population trends, distributions, demographics, employment, so lots of stuff, but I focused on the housing. And this is the map he did. And this is Oberlin residents of Negro population. So you can see, if I can get my arrow up here. So this would be Tappan Square here, and this is the business district. So you can clearly see the delineation. East side of town, except for these few exceptions up here. This would have been that paved block there that we just referenced. So this is from his study. The principal concentration of Negroes here in the southeastern section, along Follette Street, down here, paralleling the railroad, and then along East Lorraine, North Park Street at the upper right corner, and then a few other extremes. For geographical distribution, he only says, this is quoting, racial and nationality elements of a community's population quite commonly segregate into colonies of their own kinds. Differences in occupation and in ownership of wealth, coupled with differentials in culture generally, usually result in the stratification of such communities into quite clearly defined economic and social classes. Which I read to mean, this is the natural way of things. You know, not that this is a problem or that this is caused by these restrictions or caused by racism. But there is a counterpoint right at that same time from Homer Tucker, who is a black student and minister studying black churches and Oberlin in general, right around the same time as Zorba. Published around 1940. This is quoting Tucker. In most communities, the Negro population is segregated into areas characterized by marked physical deterioration. This is not true in Oberlin with respect to the natural and physical outlay of the land. It is true that the sections in which most Negroes live are poorly kept, but this is due to several factors, including the economic status, the low cost of property in these sections, the more recent development of these areas, and two, there is an element of restrictions caused by some real estate concerns which will not rent nor sell certain property to Negroes. So, he's saying it's not just natural, this isn't just happening, there are these other forces at play. And Maxie, that female student earlier, said the same thing, or a similar thing. If it is customary for Negroes to be admitted into certain houses, one can easily see that something else beside the desire or the ability to pay determines the section in which you may live. So Zorba's map here was 1935. We're going to jump back and forth between 1910 and 1940 census data, just so you can see a different form of that same map, but also see how segregation gets worse over time, at least in that time period. So this is a 1910 census where black and mulatto individuals were noted. So you can see this seems a little bit more broad. In 1910, we're a little earlier, there's a little more scattering, but each of these heavier rings, those are clusters. So there's a lot more people in those areas. But you can see a few people on the west side. But, and that's a close-up of the southeast portion of town. So I was curious about some of those outliers. Who is on the west side of town? Because, I think I've been saying that's not very common. But you can see the one person over here on Forest Street was Violet Petty, a woman who was a servant on that side of town. This one, Marguerite Black, I was actually interested in her. She's head of household and works in massage and artwork. So I'm like, I want to learn more about her. And then you have the Holden and Locke families listed as mulatto. So they have a whole household on the west side. That's in 1910. You can see by 1940 that home is now listed as white family living there. And then this is interesting too. This is a map that shows individuals from the census versus homeowners of the census. So you can see that when you take away all of these individuals, it's back to the map that we were expecting. East side of town and especially the southeast side further on East Lorraine. So those are, for the most part, individuals representing on the west side. Then 1910 to 1940, you had that time change. This is individuals. So you can see by 1940, a lot of those individuals are also gone. So I think some of that is due to dormitories shifting or boarding houses and domestic servants. There aren't going to be as many in 1940. But regardless of the cause, when you have less interaction in town, it just becomes more common that you're not used to living next to each other. I was curious about some of those outliers again. This was on, I think, Cedar or Forest Street here. You can see Nettie McDowell, who is a maid still living on the west side. You have the Mitchell family. So that is a black-owned home throughout both 1910 and 1940 census. So they did continue there. But I do wonder if they held on, but how many other people could get into that neighborhood? It's different holding onto your property compared to buying into. And then the Gordon family, which I found interesting, they were in the 1910 census listed as mulatto, and then you have perhaps an interracial marriage of Idaline and Paul Rose in 1940, but then I looked at Idaline, and you have Idaline up here, so that was a family home, again, that continued through the census. And yet, back to that Zorba map. All right. So, oh, sorry, that's why I wanted to talk about the Zorba map. So, maps don't get at the reasons, but before I move on, I just wanted to read one more quote from Homer Tucker, writing in the 1940s. He said, "Considering the portion of unpaved streets in Oberlin, the proportion of unpaved streets in the southeast section is exceedingly large. City water and sewers, for the most part, follow the pavings. Within the city limits of Oberlin, there are 66 streets on which 55 houses have occupants that use outdoor toilets. Of this number, 45 families are colored and 10 are white. This description suggests that the Negro people are more exposed to uncomfortable living conditions than the whites." So he just calls out one factor of health and sanitation, but what else would, if you have segregated housing, what else does that affect? Do they have streetlights? Are these as safe neighborhoods as elsewhere in town? How are voting precincts and political power? Are they neighborhood precincts? And they were back then. What about school segregation? When you had neighborhood schools, you're going to have de facto segregated schools as well. It affects access to transportation, to fresh food, to health, and to zoning decisions. Not so much of an issue in Oberlin, but you can believe in many other communities, industries were put closer to minority populations. Let's move forward a bit in time, 1940s. So this is a memory of Reverend Charles Maley, who wanted to move to Oberlin, but could only buy housing in certain areas. I'll just read from here. So this is the interviewer. How did you decide to come to Oberlin? I was having problems in Cleveland, and I felt that I ought to move to the outskirts. A man that lived here, my cousin and the woman he married, they lived here, and they were offering me to come to Oberlin, and even went ahead and found this house out there. I never should have moved out there, and he was referring to Hamilton Street. I spent an awful lot of money on that house. I even put in a bath. It didn't even have a bath in there or an inside toilet. I had to put in an inside toilet in there. I had to do a lot of work out there. I put a lot of money in there. If I had bought a place, I sold my place, I had money. If I could have bought a place in Oberlin, it would have been very difficult for me to buy a good house in Oberlin at that time. She asked why. Because of the prejudice. They wouldn't want you to live in certain areas. In this area, I never would have been able to move into what's Spring Street. Of course, this was sparsely settled through there. So he's reflecting on 1947. We're creeping up in time and nothing is changing. But nationally, there is a big change. So Shelley versus Kramer is one of the landmark Supreme Court decisions related to this. In short, there was a new development intended, I just jumped ahead in my entire script, sorry about that. So the Shelley family wanted to purchase a home, and they didn't know about a neighborhood restrictive covenant. This is in St. Louis, Missouri. So they purchased the property. And then Kramer's and other white neighbors wanted to enforce the covenant and prevent them from taking ownership. The Missouri Supreme Court upheld the covenant as it was private. What could the state do about this private restriction? But it went all the way up to the courts, and the 14th Amendment said that the state could not deny equal protection. What about the private homeowners? Well, the Supreme Court decided that judicial enforcement was state action, and so a violation of the Constitution. So this is finally the law that struck down what was happening on Hollywood Street, that was not legal. As far as we know, or as far as I know, B.J. Jones was the first Black Oberlinian to have a house on Hollywood Street in the 1970s. This court case, although it did change a lot, it actually didn't affect some of the federal programs that still required restrictions. We're going to jump to North Prospect Street, and this is a bit of a saga here. How many of you are familiar with North Prospect Street and the story there? Okay, so a couple people. All right. So it has really nothing to do with law. It's about how things play out in reality. So North Prospect Street, so this is before North Prospect Street. So you have Prospect Street here, you can see it's dead ending. This is Mercy Hospital, the old hospital here, so just west of the hospital. So within a few years, there is this short development of North Prospect Street. There are going to be two parts of North Prospect Street. So this was what white homeowners, for the most part, wanted to be the end of Prospect Street. You can see it had a little cul-de-sac here, and that was the end of the street. But what happened is that Eva Mae Parker Crosby wanted to start a new development up there. She knew black homeowners needed more opportunities here in Oberlin. She always hoped it would be integrated, but that was her primary focus. Crosby was a black female attorney, Oberlin school teacher in pretty much every field I could find, and real estate broker. She was born in Selma, Alabama in 1911 to Alfred and Fanny Parker, who moved to Cleveland and then came to Oberlin when she was a freshman in high school. So she graduated from the high school in 1929, and here you can see her on the debate team. She then went on to earn her AD degree from Oberlin College, and then her law degree from Ohio State University Law School in '36, becoming the first black woman to do so from their school. And her husband, Norval Crosby, was minister of Mount Zion Baptist Church. So she was very involved. She was in the war and price and ration boards during World War II, justice of the peace for 8 years on the Oberlin Library Board. She pushed for the tenure of Betty Glenn Thomas, the first black teacher of the Oberlin Public Schools, City Charter Commission. I mean, very, very engaged community player. But this is about her new development. You can see a new building project started back in April by Mrs. Eva Mae Parker Crosby of 174 East Lorraine. I find it funny, they publish everyone's address in the newspaper sometimes. Will, if it proves successful, maintain Oberlin's reputation as a pioneer in the field of race relations. So they're harkening back to that earlier history. But honestly, by the time this article is published in August of 1956, the whole development is already in trouble. So we're going to jump back to June. So this is a map I'll keep coming back to, but you can see throughout this debate, this is how the map looked. You had that dead-end street that was already built, and then this up here is Eva Mae Parker Crosby's dream, the other North Prospect. And you can see there is a separation there. So this article was published in June of '56. North Prospect Street resident to join fight extension. Residents of North Prospect Street have made the first move in an attempt to block the extension of their street to connect with the new residential development to the north. And I'm going to be pulling quotes from here. Purpose for which the corporation was formed, according to the charter, is to provide a park for amusement and recreation of the members and guests. The park is to be located just north of the street and will include a strip of privately owned land 4 feet wide and 60 feet long immediately north of the circle at the end of the street. So this tiny little park clearly designed to prevent development. And Mrs. Crosby had fully expected to be able to connect to the street. She was expecting no issues from the abstract company, the city, anyone with real authority. And she said there will be no color line drawn in that place. She said, we have tried to plan this as allotment like College Park, which is on East College Street, like Cassidy, Stewart, in that area. He said the minimum floor space required will be the same as in College Park. No cement blockhouses will be allowed, nor will temporary basement homes be tolerated. So, she's not doing anything outrageous. She's building houses. This is August of '56. Results still uncertain as first lots are sold at interracial housing site. And the article praises her dream. And she says, this property will be sold to members of only one human race. I just screwed up that quote for you, I'm sorry. This property will be sold to members of only one race, the human race. That would have been more dramatic there. The article says, other areas in town are theoretically interracial, but in practice, only a few have worked out that way. I like that phrase, worked out that way. Like it was just happening in town. So on this slide, you can, this is the article, it jumps back and forth between quoting her. It is Mrs. Crosby's belief that, for the most part, the Negroes of the community have equal opportunities in regards to jobs, but that all too often men and women who work with Negroes daily are unwilling to accept a Negro into their neighborhood without complaint. It is this paradox toward which her project is aimed. I was warned, she says, that Negroes of the wrong caliber would cause great depreciation of the property value. My immediate response was that people of any race who did not properly care for the land would cause it to lose value. By the time of this article, 8 lots had already been sold. And this is quoting again. All purchasers thus far have been Negroes. Several white residents have made inquiries concerning the land, some out of an interest in buying property there, others to ascertain that Negroes would not be living across the street or next door to them. So after that article, this is just later in August, so basically the people of the established North Prospect Street felt like they were being criticized. So they wanted to respond. This is a letter to the editor from North Prospect Street Park Association. And I'm just reading relevant parts. The article in last week's edition has caused serious concern among some of those opposed to her land speculation. The article and some of Mrs. Crosby's statements in particular seem to give the impression that such opposition exists to her enterprise is based solely on racial bias. This is unfortunate not only because it gives an untrue picture of those who are opposed, but also because it hides the fact that a large part of the opposition to Mrs. Crosby's venture stems from grounds quite as important as those suggested by the article. So basically they were arguing other parts of the development. They said that, those who had already built there, they bought there with the understanding that it would not be extended. And that extending it creates traffic hazard. What about the kids who are walking on the street? They said that her proposed lots are, according to them, cheap per square footage, and the immediate result will be, if she succeeds, the depreciation of property value. They questioned how homeowners of a new development will have funds to have homes of superior quality or invest in things besides water and sewage. They said there was not enough design oversight. And they accused her, this is my favorite, they accused her of wanting to make money on her housing development. I think you would accuse anyone else of doing the same thing. I don't know if she responded. There are still some articles I need to find. But as early as December of 1856, the city of Oberlin hoped for a resolution and a connection of the circle. But by January of 57, Crosby just said, I've got other things to deal with, and she went on with other aspects of her project, like water. Easy, right? Water. This is from June of 1957. Come together, Locke urges factions in waterline dispute. So, quoting, the North Prospect Park Association does not see any need to extend the present water line, and consequently sees no need to grant the easement. They refused to comment at the city council meeting of why they refused to grant just the water easement. This isn't even like surface development, this is just connecting a water line underneath. All of the petitioners for the water line were Black community members. And the city was legally hesitant to condemn that strip of land between and take control to connect the water line. Just a quick look at that again. So we're talking about this area here, that park can't connect to that water line. So then the alternative, well, maybe since they're already going around, you can connect to the Hollywood Street water line. Even though the city at that time said they did not like dead-end water lines, which that absolutely would be, they were willing to look at that. This is another, let's see, quote, installation of water and sewer lines from Union Street is to begin today or tomorrow. Crosby stated the pushback from North Prospect Street was to oppose Negroes moving into the area, and that it seemed to be about devaluating property. So she explained the restrictions that would ensure value would be retained. Okay, so we can connect to Hollywood Street, right? No. I'll be reading the caption. Construction of water and sewer lines to a housing development was held up when property owners stretched a wire fence across Union Street at Hollywood in Oberlin and hung up a no trespassing sign. Here, Mrs. Eva May Parker, Crosby, and J.L. Stewart of Oberlin Homes Development Enterprises are shown with City Manager Fred E. Weisbrod, who said no action would be taken to remove the fence until council has met in emergency session with City Solicitor Robert Farr. Another bit of that, so we have blocked entrance. The city is trying to work fast to get this resolved. And overnight, this fence grows. The fence made of chicken wire, wood railing, and wire was added to overnight with a small building to block heavy machinery from passing. And council was held up by legal advice and that only 4 members were in town. Small town politics. But the fence was removed by Friday morning, so just a few days later. The protesters, again their concern, said that the plans hadn't been approved by the state yet. They had. They said that that part of Union Street wasn't used as a right-of-way that the city had control over. It was. And one of those owners at the corner eventually sued the city over this issue. Hollywood Street residents also protested, claiming water and sewer lines were inadequate for serving additional owners. And what about the traffic that would be coming through? So this is a quote I like from the city council meeting. It was pointed out that residents of Hollywood Street use all the streets of Oberlin, and that others have the same right to use all city streets. Also, Dick Warren, who was one of those who was opposed to the project, questioned Mrs. Crosby as to the kind of homes planned for the area. But when Mrs. Crosby asked Warren what he paid for his home, Warren answered, "That's none of your business." I love her asking him. Mrs. Crosby, quoting the article, who had been quoted in a Cleveland paper as saying some opposition to the new development stemmed from racial prejudice, faced Dr. W.E. Morrison and charged that Morrison told her that residents on North Prospect Street organized to oppose entrance of Negroes into the neighborhood and she said, "We're going to fight you. You can see," Mrs. Crosby said, "why I would be here fighting for my rights." And Morrison said nothing. How many of you are feeling tired of this saga already? And I ask that because how many similar developments do you think ended with people getting so discouraged about the support they're not getting from the community, the direct neighbors, or just the delays that would add to the cost of the development? I'm going to pause a little bit from the newspaper articles. This is an oral history from Rosamond Watson. She is one of the first residents, Jehu Clifford Watson and Rosamond Sonora Harris Watson, some of the first people to build in the new development, and they were recruited by Mrs. Crosby. She was interviewed in 1985. Unfortunately, the recording is hard to hear, but I'll read excerpts. So this is the interview saying, can you talk about the housing? She's saying, "Until about 20 years ago, I've been told, in fact, I have observed myself, that Black people were not free to live all over Oberlin. They had a designated area that they were expected to stay in." Which area was that? That was over on the southeast side of Oberlin. And of course, they always say across the tracks. There was one elderly family that, I don't know them personally, but I would see them occasionally, that lived over on the west side. But Black people were made very much aware that they were not wanted over on that side of town. And then I'm trying to think, it was about 20 years ago that this area was opened up all over Oberlin, and people could rent or buy, because about 30 years ago, my husband and I wanted to buy on this street, meaning Prospect, and I was told by one of the real estate developers not to, that we would be very unhappy here. Then eventually things did materialize in this area. And we were about the third house to build out there, and that was about 25 years ago. She, meaning Crosby, tried so hard to get it integrated. And I don't know, she couldn't get it integrated. After her husband moved, because he was the minister of Mount Zion for a while, he moved to Columbus after he gave up his ministry here, his pastorate. She followed him, naturally she went with him, and then things then began to open up after that. White families began to move in. And I dare say that just from what we call the circle, there's about 5 white families now, and everyone lives together in near accord. So, this map again, because I wanted to show you what she's talking about driving. Mrs. Crosby, when she first started building out here, that street was closed, as I said before, the little circle there, the cul-de-sac, and she wanted it open because we used to have to come by Hollywood. That's the next street east of here. We used to have to come up Hollywood, then to Union, then to North Prospect this way. And that was the most miserable road. It was unpaved and it had great big chuckles. Some of them looked as if they were as big as a chamber pot. Bill Long, who still lives in Oberlin, I think he's working at the Co-op again, he came out here to a meeting of the residents, and he suggested that we all get together and put our money together and pave that street, and then have the city take it over and keep it up. So that was quite a thing, because everybody had a heavy mortgage at that time. because all these houses were new out here, and that meant going down into your nest egg or your savings account to the extent of about $350 a piece. We did, and we got it paved, and the city has kept it up ever since. So, just a few photos of that construction. Looks like hard work construction. So you can see on the right is the home of the Watsons. This is a different view, kind of looking west at this. So this is the new development here, and just over on this side would have been that cul-de-sac that has not been connected yet. You can see in the telephone book, the city directory, this is all Prospect Street, and says, and open from dead end to dead end, south of Union. So this is residents of the new development. And again, the home of Fred Owens there on the right. So more problems. A small area, a big problem. So this is about the connection. When is it finally going to happen? It doesn't happen until late 1962. So I think our first article was 1956. This is a long struggle. This is from a 1963 article called Teacher, Lawyer, Battler. This is about Mrs. Crosby. Indicates that at least by then the streets had been connected. Quote, she has not yet sold a house in her allotment to a non-Negro person, but the opening of the circle in effect gives the area a semblance of integration through two arcs of the circle, though two arcs of the circle serve as a dividing line. So these are photos from the 1960s where you can see that's the original, that's the cul-de-sac, and the streets have finally been connected there. Just another view from the air there. And then a few, for some reason, the 1970 city directing, they're not up on things, so they still have it marked as dead end, even though they have connected. And then you can see 1970s maps starting to reflect just one street there. Before we leave North Prospect, I just wanted to talk a little bit more about Eva Mae Parker Crosby. She moved to Columbus in 1963 and continued as a junior high math teacher, integrating the faculty of that school. And she was there until the death of her husband in 1966, just shortly after the move from Oberlin. After that, she ran the Crosby Funeral Home and continued practicing law, particularly for people with limited resources. In 1986, she was inducted to the Women's Hall of Fame, and in 1999, she was named Black Woman of Courage in Columbus. She died in 2002 and is buried with her husband in Westwood Cemetery. So we got from the 1950s into the 60s. We're going to jump into just a few personal stories from our oral histories. The first one is from Ronnie Rimmer, who many of you might know by many means, but also a city council member. His family had come from Alabama and then Kentucky, and he was interviewed in 2018. He's talking about Smith Street. So if you're looking at a map, it's at the southern end of Oberlin. It says, first memory I can remember as a little guy with Smith Street was a dirt road, and you know it was dirt at that time. 1954, by then I was probably 5 or 6. You know, in 1959, but it was still a dirt street. I can remember my dad going through the efforts of getting the community to support having a road paved and what they had to go through. I can remember that. It was an interesting time. It was a proud time for the community at that point, once we did get the road and we got sidewalks and felt more a part of the community. Did you get streetlights at all? Yes. But at that time, especially being a black family, and all the black families in Oberlin were on the south side, period. Phyllis Yarber Hogan has done a considerable amount of research on Lincoln Street, or what then was called Follett Street. Residents, this is 1946, residents were calling for water, sewer, sidewalks, and a paved road, at least by 46. This is from 1955. Follett Street, which has neither pavement or sidewalks, is lined with houses such as the one above. Many of them do not have running water or sewage systems, and many residents cannot afford the available gas system. So they're calling for streets in 1946. They weren't paved until 1967. And even the name change between Follett to Lincoln kind of falls in different sides of the street based on race. Moving ahead a little bit to the housing code and fair housing, I actually cut a lot of this stuff out because this is not exactly the most scintillating information. I did rely on a book called Leadership in a Small Town, which has a lot of info but makes some very suspect blanket statements about the black community members. According to this book, in 1957, between 85 and 90% of the city's Black population was concentrated in the southeast section of town. On the slide here it says, housing is the third field of discrimination besides jobs and finances. Here, real estate agents and landlords openly follow the racial policies which are practiced by their professions in most parts of the United States. With the exception of one house, all of the real estate developments in Oberlin in recent years have been either all white or all Negro. The exception is College Park on the east side of town. Parts of the book focus on the city of Oberlin's development of a housing code, which doesn't necessarily relate to housing segregation, except that many of the people who were impacted, the bad side of segregation meant that they often needed more help being up to code with their homes. But for the purpose of this presentation, a newly formed, integrated, open occupancy housing committee formed in May of 1960 to try and investigate housing segregation. And I'm just going to hit some highlights that are mentioned in the book. One is Willowbrook Farms, that's, if you're looking at a map, Kimberly Circle on the far east side of town, in which case they had heard that new people interested in buying property there that Black homeowners would not be welcome. So they thought they would try and test this by sending in people to see if a sale would happen or fall through. Unfortunately, they couldn't gather anything definitive about what the landowners were doing. It was more a sense, and that is very often the case in housing discrimination. You know, it's not going to be written down, and it's often not going to be verbalized in a way that you can call it racial discrimination. These were comments directly from developers. This is about Robin Park, which is on the far west on your map. This is William Gauman, developer of Robin Park, said that owners prefer to have control over ownership in the development, and that an ordinance regarding fair housing would be unenforceable, and that if it were passed, he would keep doing what he was doing and take it to the courts. In her oral history, Charlotte Baker attributes this to racism. She said Burl Scott tried getting land and couldn't, so he asked a white person to get it for him. Kenneth Clark also is surveyed or interviewed as part of the book, and he shared that he had told renters of his new building and that there would not be Black tenants. Fearing to do so would discourage other renters. And of course he means other white renters. Based on ownership on North Prospect and Gladys Court, he also believed that most people didn't want integrated housing. He said an FAA administrator said that they would not buy his houses unless he guaranteed not to sell to Black people. Clark said a code would give him something to point to ensure to open occupancy. And I apologize, every time I think about this presentation, I want to do more about Gladys Court. If you know the history of that property, please find me afterward or leave me a note because that's next in the research. According to the book, again, real estate agents blatantly said that they showed Black buyers to only Black neighborhoods. They claimed many white sellers specified the home should only be sold to whites, and they claimed property values fell when Black owners moved in. So, you know, from the 1960s, they're quite open about this. You know, this is what we do, and this is why we do it. Public hearing about a new fair housing ordinance was held in 1961, despite objections to it. And people there, a question was asked of the group. An opponent to the fair housing said, if one were against the code, would you say he is anti-Negro? And many in the audience said yes. So even if race didn't come up in the language of it, it was very much a part of what was being discussed. Now, Ira Porter did not like it, and he filed a suit about the constitutionality of Oberlin Fair Housing Ordinance. And this is the Porter from very early on that, you remember that letter from 1919 of the East College Street residents. He was one of those 4 people who went to Elyria to block that sale. He shows up in a lot of things related to this, not on the right side of history. The case went through several courts, and if I'm reading correctly, law is not my specialty, the law held over all except for some of the enforcement part, which was too vague. So that was Oberlin making strides a few years before the Federal Fair Housing Act of 1968 as part of the Civil Rights Act of 1968, which prohibited discrimination in the sale, rental, and financing of housing on the basis of race, color, religion, or national origin. and it gave housing and urban development powers of enforcement. But again, back to that earlier question, how do you actually prove discrimination? We're going to jump ahead a bit to post-fair housing, and that's sarcastic quotes too. So this is a story from Glenn Hodge. I will admit there's a lot of back and forth in this conversation. I'm just going to be pulling out excerpts. So the interviewer is saying, I was wondering, about what year did you build your house? He said, I think it was in 1983. I had a difficult time financing it. Well, I went to several banks in Oberlin. Of course, I was working at GM, and my wife was working for Tri-C. She was working as a coordinator for their technological center, so we both had good jobs. So I went to Oberlin. I think at the time it was People's Bank, not sure, back in 1983. They wouldn't even talk. And this is the interview saying, just because you were black, just because we were black. So my wife had done some consulting work with some bankers in Elyria, so I went over there. He said, how much do you need? I think I needed about $10,000. He wrote the check right on the spot. And then I jumped into the interview. I was mostly observing and said, do you remember how did the conversation go? Said they didn't even look at our finances. It was like there was just no way. And I said, what do you mean? The bank is responding, there's no way we'll touch it. So Glenn Hodge said, well, okay. The next thing they knew, this is Hodge talking, I went to Clark Brothers first to build the house. They kind of hemmed and hawed, so I ended up going to Amherst to Strauss Construction. They built the house, and the next thing you knew, the house was up. Of course, the neighbors gave me a hard time. The neighbors? What neighbors? At first, the house was too small because they had poured the footer for the sunken living room, the sunken family room. Then the house was too big, so I had to weather that. Then the neighbor behind me complained the contractor was starting too early, as if we didn't have a code enforcer. I went through that. We even know he exhales in the interview. I went through that. But anyway, I lived through that, and the house was built, and we've been living there since '83. We moved in '84, I think. And I asked him, have you heard other people share similar stories of difficulties with housing, black residents? He said, no, I haven't. That was your personal, and he said, that was my personal experience. I'm sure some of them did. Yes, and this is him. It was an eye-opener because I didn't expect it from the hometown I had grown up in, but they just flat out rejected me without taking a look at any of the financials. Moving a bit up, this is Betty Spurlock in 1984, and I assure you I'm getting close to the end here. We're moving up in time. This is the interview saying, I think I was saying that Oberlin has such a reputation for being a liberal and integrated town. How do you account for that? Betty Spurlock says, oh, I think it's because historically there were more blacks here than any small community around, and it's because of the sentiments of the college. This goes way back to the 1800s, you see, so that even in those days, about a third of the people in Oberlin were black. And so that, in a sense, you feel that you go anywhere and do anything, and you do, you may. So in that way, you feel that it is a liberal town. However, I think housing until the 1950s, the black people lived on one side of the town, more or less. Once in a while, there'd be one or two families who might move out. That, of course, could have something to do with economics also. The smaller homes were in this part of the town, so that you couldn't say it was entirely segregation that made it happen. But nevertheless, blacks lived on one end of town, and the more affluent people lived on the other end. So that, in a sense, it was liberal, but really when it came down to it, there were points beyond which you didn't go. And closer to now, this is an email from Jean Simon. She said, I know there's a realtor here who guides folks away from white areas, even though they can afford to buy in those areas. I've had friends who have gone through this and decided not to buy or live in Oberlin because of this treatment. There are friends who could have paid cash for their homes, but were directed to homes that were in disrepair. And since doing this program for the first time, I've heard similar stories, and again, welcome those stories. We're going to get to the legacy. So the Color of Law, that book Richard Rothstein does, share key examples of how, despite the Fair Housing Act of '68, while progress may have been made in some areas of anti-discrimination, once housing segregation was established, it is very difficult to reverse. Black individuals often had or have less disposable income to buy homes. And what are some of those reasons just related to housing? Well, with limited places to live historically, as I said, landlords could charge higher rent. Some cities taxed black neighborhoods higher than white neighborhoods nearby. And oftentimes their transportation budget was higher because they had to commute further to get to their jobs from segregated neighborhoods. More recently, subprime loan companies targeted minority neighborhoods. And again, many of those housing programs that specifically benefited white families in the 1940s and 50s meant black families were locked out and are still locked out. Also, with mortgages unavailable through some of those programs, buying a house on contract could cost more, and it also meant that one missed payment could mean the loss of your home. There was a very fine line of continuing to be able to pay. Also, those homes in white neighborhoods have risen in value more in black neighborhoods, meaning white families can pass on more wealth and just perpetuate the inequality. So many families don't have the home equity to cover health emergencies, college education, and when you think there are quite a few incentives that privilege homeowners as opposed to renters, and again, who is a homeowner? And of course, not of course, but some federal programs, it took a long time for them to open up, not be segregated, and also vouchers often don't pay enough for people to move to non-segregated areas. And a lot of those new housing developments are built in segregated areas, so it just perpetuates itself. The slide up here relates to, this is 2021, NBC did a feature about a black family, the Austins, in San Francisco, who, keep in mind this is San Francisco housing prices, who had their house appraised at $1 million, which was lower than the previous appraisal, and the housing market was going up, so they were, a little confused about that. They removed all of their art, family photos, books, anything that would imply black ownership, and they asked a white friend to stand in when the appraiser arrived. And that appraisal was $500,000 higher. They settled a lawsuit in this year, 2023. So don't want to leave entirely on a note. I mean, there's action, there's education. So we can talk about segregation and know that it wasn't just attitudes, it was policies and deliberate policies, and policies can be changed. When your local city or government has initiatives that support housing, support those initiatives, including funding them and funding the staffing to do them, along with equity initiatives. Advocate for affordable housing. Try not to give in to the knee-jerk reaction of not in my backyard attitudes. Get affordable housing in all neighborhoods. Of course, homeownership is tied to income. What are we paying? What's the minimum wage? Do people have transportation to jobs? I mean, it's great to sometimes have soaring house values if you are a homeowner, but just remember, who does that disproportionately advantage? Educate real estate agents, lenders, and appraisers. They may not know that history through no fault of their own, but to learn it, they might be more aware of their own practices or the practices of their fellows. Increase the value of vouchers so people can live in non-low-income neighborhoods. Be aware of zoning and how that can get tricky and restrict some families. And incentivize integrated development. I know many of us do not have control over some of those things, but I think we can all do our part for awareness and supporting what initiatives are happening. I know this is a long program and a lot of information and history we're not proud of, so I appreciate you coming tonight to listen, and I do hope you are able to share as well.